There are moments in life when the bottom falls out. And in an instant, everything changes. And you're left scrambling, trying to figure out what's going on. Other times, one small tragedy follows another, which follows another, which follows another, and then another, until they begin to snowball into an avalanche of pain and heartache and hard questions. Whether it's sickness, financial crisis, being wronged by someone you trust, or it's the loss of a loved one, these things have a way of piling up, and they can trigger for us a flood of emotions that leave us reeling and just trying to figure out what's going on. And if we aren't careful, we can find ourselves spiraling a bit in the circumstances of life, circumstances that leave us feeling like life is out of control, and that the next hit might be the one that does us in. And human experience says it can happen to any of us. And human experience says that, ironically, it often seems to happen to people that, for all accounts, it seems they deserve it the least. And when the bottom falls out, and when one painful reality piggybacks on the others, we find ourselves searching for answers. Hard times breed for us hard questions. And on the surface, at least, we want easy answers. Right? At least at the surface level of our emotions, we wish there were easy answers for the hardships of life, for the hard questions. Why is this happening? What else could go wrong? What did I do to deserve this? In a world of human brokenness, in a world marred by sin, these are not new questions. They have been with us since the garden. And in some ways, that is kind of an easy answer, right? Like it's one thing for us to say, though, that the world is the way it is, that bad things happen because of sin. It's another thing to ask the next layer of questions about why would God allow it to get that way in the first place. Down through the millennia, every human culture has asked hard questions. Every culture has wrestled with these hard questions about suffering, about the nature of evil, about injustice, and how does the divine, how does God fit in to the way things are? Where do you find God when it all falls apart, when the bottom drops out, when one thing piles on top of another, on top of another, on top of another? In the world that surrounded the Old Testament, these hard questions were often framed in the idea of stories. Stories about righteous sufferers. People who calamity befell them and there seemed to be no explanation as to why. And oftentimes those stories were about someone who couldn't quite put it all together. They were perplexed by their circumstances. They were searching for answers within the framework of their faith, whatever that faith might be, right? Across the ancient world, there's all sorts of religions. And what we find in the world of the Old Testament is lots of cultures asking the same questions in the same kinds of stories, and making sense of their worldview and their faith through those things. Now, for some cultures, it took a little different spin, right? If your belief system is polytheistic, you believe in many gods and or goddesses that exist across a moral spectrum, you might find some easy answers. You might be able to simply assume, well, it must mean that some of the less moral gods have somehow, at least temporarily, triumphed over those that are inclined towards good. And so, as you look at your faith in the divine world, you can go, okay, this makes sense. There are bad gods who apparently, in some way, are overpowering the good ones. But for the people of God in the Old Testament, what do you do when one of the cornerstones of your faith is the singularity of God? How do you make sense of these moments when the bedrock of your understanding of who God is "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one"? How do you make sense of these things when you can't simply pawn it off on some other God taking control? For the people of God, the question had to be framed differently. Because what do you do if you believe that God truly is good and that God truly is all-powerful, and yet you look around at your circumstances or the world around you and you see pain and suffering? Hard times breed for us hard questions. And those hard questions frame the story of a man named Job that we meet in the Old Testament. Now, as we're going to come to see over the next couple of weeks, that those aren't really the questions the book is all that interested in answering. Right? We come to the book of Job expecting it to be a book about why do bad things happen to good people. But the book itself isn't all that concerned in answering that question. But it's those hard questions, questions about evil, questions about injustice, questions about suffering, that build the framework of Job's story. And then within that framework, the writer works to subvert our expectations and begins to offer us a different set of questions to ask. It begins to challenge us to see things differently than that. The book itself is among the most complex in the Old Testament. All right, we need to do some spade work here at the outset to kind of set up our understanding of this book. It is a bit complex. It's what we call wisdom literature, so it's kind of like Proverbs, kind of like Ecclesiastes. It talks at times in cliches. Right? The nice thing about Proverbs is they're like bumper stickers. Sometimes they're true, right? That's kind of true for all of wisdom literature. We're going to talk about the things that usually happen this way, the things that are true most of the time. And then we go, well, but what about? And wisdom literature goes, well, of course there are exceptions, but this is how things should work. All right? So there's some complexity in the way we understand the book because of that. The opening and closing of Job's story is framed in a narrative. It's a story. But that story quickly gives way to a long, complex dialogue between Job and his three friends. And so this is a story, but it's a story that's told in the form of Hebrew poetry. Right? So it's kind of like that day you're sitting in English class and your teacher hands you Shakespeare and asks you to write a paper on its themes, right? You can read it. You know the words that are on the page, but it takes a little bit of work to get into understanding how the writing flows, because it's written differently. It's written as poetry. It's written as dialogue and not simply a narrative. The book doesn't do us a lot of favors. It contains really, really difficult language, really archaic and odd vocabulary. To up the level of challenge for people who study Job at an academic level, like the best copies of the book of Job we have are not in good shape. So there's big chunks missing. So we can't even go back and say, oh, this makes really clear what this is. There are some passages we're trying to put back together kind of piecemeal. It's a difficult book to make sense of at times. We don't know who wrote it. We aren't even sure when it was written. The story seems to be set, as best we can tell, within the age of the patriarchs, like Abraham and those guys way back in the book of Genesis. But it's just as likely that the book as we know it didn't get written until late in the period of the Old Testament. So it's a book full of hard questions in and of itself. And for a book that's driven by hard questions, it doesn't offer us a lot of easy answers. The book of Job is challenging and complex. But it has for us meaning. It has for us the Word of God for the people of God. And so we want to spend some time probing this story of a man named Job and the search for easy answers in hard times. To get us started this morning, I invite you to turn with me to the opening of the book of Job. Job chapter 1. If you're following along in YouVersion, everything will be there for you in the events tab. Job chapter 1. We want to begin in verse 1. Now, in the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. He was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turn holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice burnt offerings for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. So here, let's pause, because we're introduced in the opening words to the book's primary human character. He is a man named Job. And what we're told about Job right off the top is that he is a non-Israelite. He's from the land of Uz. The book, as it progresses, seems to put him among the Edomites. But despite the fact that he exists outside the covenant people of God, he's presented to us here in the opening lines of the book as an ideal saint. Right? He is righteous, he is blameless, he fears God and shuns evil. The book, from the outset, uses language that kind of reminds us of the sacrificial system, of the holiness that is required for the temple and the offerings that are made there. Even though it never references that system, Job is cast in this ideal standing. Righteous, blameless, upright, he fears God, he shuns evil. He is for us the ideal saint. And in addition then to his upstanding character, we're told about his great wealth. The text delineates out for us all the great things that he had and the numbers that get used to tell us how many sheep and how many oxen and how many camels. The numbers themselves are symbolic of wholeness. The picture that's being painted is this is the best a guy could be, both in terms of his morality and in terms of his wealth. We know from what the book tells us Job owned, that his business enterprise has to stretch over a mass amount of geography. You don't have camels in the same place you herd sheep, right? And so when we begin thinking, okay, so where is he doing all of this stuff, and you start plotting it on a map, Job is a man of incredible wealth that spreads out over a variety of business interests. He is, by all standards, the ideal. And what we might miss, but what would have been really clear to anybody in the ancient world that is reading this story and just comes upon that description we just read, is the way that those things, moral character and material blessing, seem to go together. Right? The mindset of the ancient Near East was very much a simple this equals this. Material blessing is evidence of God's favor. God's favor is only bestowed upon those who are righteous. Therefore, if you have a bunch of stuff, you must be moral. And if you are moral and upright, then you must have a bunch of stuff. And the book from the outset has kind of laid those two things side by side for us. And so, in terms of the mindset, the worldview surrounding the Old Testament, we might be impressed by Job's great wealth. We shouldn't be surprised by it. The original audience would hear that and go, well, of course, if he's moral and upright, he fears God, shuns evil, of course he has all this stuff. Of course he is blessed beyond measure. Because if you're righteous, you're blessed. And so Job is blessed. That must mean he's righteous. Job is righteous. That must mean he's blessed. But very quickly, the book shifts its focus. After we're introduced to Job, we're told about his expansive wealth. All of a sudden, we step into, unexpectedly, a cosmic drama that is unfolding around Job. Let's pick the text back up in verse 6. And one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord. And the Satan also came with them. And the Lord said to the Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil." "Does Job fear God for nothing?" Satan replied. "Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You've blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, everything he has is in your hands, but on the man himself do not lay a finger." Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Verse 13, one day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at their oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you." So all of a sudden, we get a glimpse behind the curtain, if you will. We're ushered into the heavenly throne room for what the world around the Old Testament would think of as a divine council, an assembly, if you will, in heaven. God is seated on his throne, and the sons of God, these divine beings, angels, we refer to them perhaps, come to report in. And as they come and assemble before the throne of God, our attention is drawn to one among their number, Satan. Or technically, the text calls him the Satan. It seems at this point to be more of a title than a name. We might talk about him as the accuser, the examiner, And it's important for us to understand how that functions in the book of Job, like to start us off, right? We sometimes forget the Old Testament gets written over the course of about 1,000 years. And then we've got about 400 years from the close of the Old Testament to the start of the New Testament. And so there are some ideas that come into sharper focus as we go through that process. God begins to clarify some things in human understanding. And it seems, as best we can tell, the character of Satan is one of those things that kind of morphs a bit over time. If we just have the book of Job, we don't get any indication that he's the serpent in the garden. We don't get any indication, in fact, that he is the embodiment of evil. He's one of the sons of God, the angels who come before the throne of God to report in. Doesn't change the character of Satan, okay? Don't hear me saying what I'm not. But it does help us reframe how we read the book of Job if we're going, wait, so this isn't necessarily what we hear when we're introduced to Satan. The accuser seems to have a place in God's court. It seems that he's been given a specific task. And that task seems to be to assess the faith of human beings and point out any holes that exist. And it's in that role as the accuser. And it is from that work that he is returning when God asks him, "Where have you been?" He says, "I've been going to and fro on the earth." In other words, I've been doing my job. I've been checking things out. And it's there. The drama comes back to Job. Because God says, while you were doing that, while you were going to and fro, examining the earth, looking for people to accuse, did you happen to see my servant Job? And it seems that there's almost a fatherly pride in the question. Have you seen Job? Did you meet him in your travels? There's no one quite like him. He's upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. And those words become huge for how we're going to understand the rest of the book. It's subtle, but we have to make sure we catch this. God has just affirmed for us what the narrator told us at the beginning of the story. Right? We're introduced to Job as a man who is upright, who fears God and shuns evil. And when God steps into the story here, he affirms everything the narrator has said. Job is everything the narrator made him out to be. God has weighed in on Job's character here at the beginning and still grants the accuser permission to afflict him, which forces us to wrestle with those hard questions and with our desire for easy answers. Because the world around the Old Testament had a very easy answer for the problem of evil. Evil things happen because people are evil. But the narrator just told us Job is upright. He fears God and shuns evil. And then when God has an opportunity to weigh in, what does he tell us about Job? There's no one like my servant Job. He's upright. He fears God. He shuns evil. And our easy answers don't seem to hold anymore. And I think as Job's story begins, we learn some things about our pursuit of easy answers. It's there in the teaching notes if you're following along in YouVersion and want to jot some things down. See, we want easy answers in hard times because we're unaware of God's activity. Oftentimes we come into hard times and we want easy answers in those hard times because we are unaware of God's activity. God is at work. God is doing things. We're just oblivious to it. And so when hard times come, we want easy answers. Why is this happening? And we don't get to see all of the moving parts always. I remember just a few moments ago we were singing a song, God Turn It Around. And there's the part in the song that says, God is doing something right now. He is healing someone. He is saving someone. And I can clearly in my mind imagine the moment I was standing right over there, as I do most weeks, singing along shortly after we introduced that song. And it was one of those weeks where it kind of felt all grumbly in my spirit. And I was like, well, Lord, it sure doesn't seem like you're doing much. And very quickly, I sensed the Holy Spirit say, that's because you can't see everything I'm doing. You're judging your perspective from where you stand in this moment. And I go, oh, you know what? I'll bet somewhere right now in the world, God is healing someone. I'll bet right now, somewhere in the world, He is saving someone. He is rescuing someone. He is doing the impossible for someone. And all of a sudden, I had to kind of repent in my spirit and go, I don't get to grumble because I don't always get to see what God is doing. But we want easy answers in hard times because we're unaware what God is doing. And so we look at the world, we look at our circumstances, and we go, well, Lord, it sure doesn't seem like you're doing much. He says, that's because you can't see everything. You don't understand the game that is afoot. See, we get the luxury of reading about Job's calamities, knowing about this cosmic chess game that is taking place in the heavenly throne room before the God of all creation and the examiner who works for him. Job doesn't get that luxury. Job is unaware of what's actually happening, of what's actually at stake. And here's what I have learned time and time again. Rarely do we get that luxury. When life falls apart, the bottom falls out, when one thing piles on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, we rarely get the perspective we need to see the bigger picture. And so often when the bottom falls out, when life falls apart, and when one thing piles on top of another, it becomes really tempting to assume that we have the whole picture. That we understand everything that is happening, both with other people who are involved in the situation and in the spiritual realm. And so when we begin to make those assumptions, it becomes easy for us to start to question God's goodness, to start to question God's sovereign control, to start to question God's deep love for us, because we don't know everything that's happening. And when we put it like that, it becomes clear this is a very prideful position to put ourselves in. To assume that we know all that we don't know. And it's that tension between Job's reality and the glimpse behind the curtain that sets this story in motion and sets up the drama of the book. Because the accuser has stepped on the scene at the beginning and promoted a worldview that everyone around the people of God would have said, sounds right. Job is righteous, so God's given him stuff. And as long as God's given Job stuff, Job's going to stay righteous. And so the accuser says, it stands to reason, if we take away all of Job's stuff, if you remove your hand of protection from him, if the only reason that Job is righteous is because he gets stuff from God, then take it all away, and he will curse you to your face. And in that statement, the accuser has not only questioned the integrity of Job's faith, he's brought into question the character and nature of God. Because the question behind the question is, will God allow people to respond to him honestly? Will God allow us to come to him when the world falls apart and the bottom falls out? And will he still love and accept and hear us when we go, Lord, I have a few questions? Or this doesn't make sense. I'm hurting, I'm angry, I'm upset. Will God allow us to respond honestly? Without fear, without favor, will God allow us to respond honestly? And will God accept our praise if it's only given with a wink wink towards health and wealth? Like, Lord, you're the best because you keep giving me stuff. Is God satisfied with that? These are the questions that the accuser has unwittingly put on the table. We come to the book of Job and we're like, well, why does bad stuff happen to good people? The accuser shows up and goes, those are good, that's fine. There's some bigger questions. And the book of Job begins to wrestle with questions about the character and nature of God, who he is, what he's like. And because of the challenge that the accuser lays down, the nature of God is as much on trial as the righteousness of Job. And so in this moment, God grants the accuser permission to take it all away. The only restriction is he's not allowed to touch Job personally, to not harm his person. Otherwise, permission is given to take it all away. And the bottom falls out. And one thing piles on top of another, on top of another, on top of another. I mentioned to you from time to time that sometimes I think we're almost afraid to read the Bible and kind of chuckle at the parts we're supposed to chuckle at because it's the Bible. Like, how dare we? There's a comedic rhythm to the way this section of the book is told. I think it's there to kind of help lighten the mood a little bit. Because it's like a servant comes running up to him and it's like, oh my goodness, we were keeping the sheep and all of a sudden these raiders came and they took everybody, they killed all the servants and I'm the only one who got away to come tell you. And the text says, and while he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, we were out in the fields and the fire from heaven fell and consumed the flocks and killed all the servants and I'm the only one who got away to come and tell you, Job. And while he was talking, another servant comes running up. It says the Chaldeans came and they formed raiding parties. They stole all of your camels. They killed all of your servants. And I'm the only one who got away. And while he was still speaking, another servant came and said the winds blew in the house where your children were gathered. And the house collapsed and they all died and their servants with them. And I'm the only one who got away. Come and tell you. And when we look at the whole picture of what is described by these servants, Job's calamities come from all 4 points of the compass. Job's calamities include natural disasters, human wickedness, and everything falls apart. The world collapses. And Job responds. Let's pick it back up in verse 20. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship. Let me read that for us again. And then he fell to the ground in worship. And said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. So the world collapses around Job, and he responds with clear signs of grief, with clear signs of lament, with clear signs of devastation. Job's faith is not some, well, you win some, you lose some, a happy-go-lucky attitude. He shaves his head. He tears his clothes. He sits in sackcloth and ashes just a little later in the text. Job is fully in the midst of every human emotion you would expect when life falls apart. He is grieving. He is lamenting. He is devastated. Then he fell to the ground in worship. The Lord has given. The Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And with those words, it becomes clear for us, Job has passed the accuser's test. Right? What was the accusation leveled against Job in the heavenly throne room? Remove your hand of protection. Strike all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. God removes his hand of protection, allows the accuser to strike everything Job has. And his response is, blessed be the name of the Lord. Which, if you're familiar with the story, does not dissuade the accuser. If you're familiar with the story of Job, you'll know that only sets up round 2. We're suddenly taken back into the heavenly throne room, and again, the angels gather to present themselves before the throne of God. And when the accuser comes, God says, so what have you been up to? Going to and fro. Been doing my job. Poking holes in people's faith. God says, well, have you considered Job? Are you convinced yet that there's no one quite like him who is upright, who fears God, who shuns evil? And the accuser says, well, of course. A person will give anything for their health. If you let me afflict him, I'll prove to you how selfish he is. That it wasn't about all the other people, the other lives. No, those who didn't get to Job, but you let me afflict him. Then he'll curse you to your face. So the text follows. Job is afflicted with painful sores across his body. He sits grieving, devastated in sackcloth and ashes, scraping his sores with broken pieces of pottery. And his wife says, why don't you just give it up? Curse God and die. Be done with it. And after round 2, Job says, we accept good from God. Should we not also accept trouble? Now, this is important for us because the book has already told us that in Job's response, he has not charged God with wrongdoing. But when his wife tells him to curse God and die, Job does not point away from God. He doesn't point to the raiders who stole his flocks. He doesn't point to the natural disasters that befell his shepherds and consumed his sheep. He doesn't get a lawyer and go sue the contractors who built the house that collapsed on his children. He doesn't even point the finger of blame at the accuser, who, from all we can tell from the book of Job, he's completely oblivious to. Even in the midst of his piety, Job sees all of this as God's doing. We accept good. Should we not also accept trouble? And all of a sudden, the questions that we came to this book with start to get that much more complex. The answers get that much harder, especially when we're soon going to see the appearance of Job's friends, who insist for the next 30 plus chapters on helping him find easy answers. They go back and forth, one to the other, trying to make sense of Job's circumstances, trying to find easy answers. So what is our takeaway here at the outset? It's clear that the book wants us to wrestle with a different sort of questions, which forces us, if we will ask those questions, to reframe how we read the rest of the book. Because what we see in Job's response here at the beginning is a broad acceptance that God is in control. A broad acceptance that God is in charge and that he's not doing anything wrong when bad things happen. Now, as the book unfolds, Job is going to ask some really hard questions. Hard questions about what it means to believe that God is good in a world that often isn't. But we come into the book with one set of questions, and then the book is inviting us to ask different questions based not on our circumstances, but on the character of God. Right? But our default mode is what? To see the world through our circumstances, to see what's happening, and to try to make sense of the world as we understand it. Job's story invites us to examine the way we see the world. It does it this way. We measure good in moments in time. God sees good as movement toward his purposes. Right? The reason we want easy answers in hard times is because we're unaware of God's activity. We're not sure what God is doing behind the scenes all the time. And so that leaves us in a place where we tend to measure good in moments in time. How are you? I'm good. Other days, how you doing? Not so good. Right? We measure good in moments in time. God sees good as movement toward his purposes. And the book of Job invites us into a conversation about God and his ways. And on the surface, for Job, for his friends, for us, the book appears to be about questions like, why do bad things happen to good people? But as we start to peel back the layers, what we're going to find is the book has very little interest in easy answers. Very little interest in answering those sort of questions. Because rather, the book wants us to allow the hard times in life to make sense of life's hard questions, all while affirming, all while reinforcing for us the goodness of the character and nature of God. And that idea sets the book of Job apart from all the other stories, because it's not interested in finding easy answers in hard times. It's an invitation to ask hard questions. Just pray with me.